There are more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt, not slightly more, roughly twice as many. Somewhere around 250 of them, clustered in fields along the Nile, steep-sided and narrow, some of them still standing after 2,500 years. They are not the ones you have seen photographs of. These are steeper, narrower and much smaller, rising at an angle close to 70 degrees, packed together in fields of dozens. And a great many of them are missing their tops, which is not weathering. In 1834, an Italian doctor turned treasure hunter named Giuseppe Ferlini worked his way through the pyramid fields at Meroe, demolishing the upper sections of around 40 of them, looking for gold. He found some in one belonging to a queen. He took it back to Europe, where for years people refused to believe it was Nubian at all because they could not accept that work of that quality had come from there. He struggled to sell it. That reaction is going to come up again. Almost nobody has heard of the people who built them, and that is strange, because those people did something no other neighbour of Egypt ever managed. They did not just resist Egypt. They did not just trade with it or raid it or get absorbed by it. They conquered it. They took the throne of the pharaohs, wore the double crown, ruled the whole of Egypt for the better part of a century, and were remembered by the Egyptians themselves as legitimate kings. Then they went home, moved their capital south, invented their own alphabet, held off the Roman Empire, and kept going for another 600 years. They were called the Kushites. And there is a particular reason you were probably never taught about them, which we will get to, because it is not really about archaeology at all. Let me start with the land, because everything here follows from the river and what is buried beside it. Nubia is the stretch of the Nile Valley running south from roughly the modern border between Egypt and Sudan, deep into what is now Sudan. Same river, very different river. In Egypt, the Nile is a broad, calm, navigable highway. You can sail up it and drift down it. That is a large part of why Egypt unified so early. South of Aswan, it stops behaving. The river runs over hard granite in a series of stretches called cataracts, where the water breaks into rapids and channels, and the riverbed is studded with rock. There are 6 of them. They are not waterfalls, but they are impassable to a loaded boat, and to get past one, you have to unload and haul your cargo overland, which means the cataracts are natural checkpoints. Whoever controls the ground beside them controls what moves. That single geographic fact shapes 3,000 years of history in this valley. Egypt could never simply absorb Nubia the way it absorbed its own floodplain, because every few hundred kilometers the river stopped cooperating and an army had to get out and walk. And Nubia could never be easily unified from one end either, for exactly the same reason. What you get instead is a corridor of separate regions, each defensible, each controlling a stretch of the most valuable trade route in that part of the world. And what moved was gold. Nubia had gold, a great deal of it in the desert east of the river. The word Nubia may itself derive from the Egyptian word for gold, though that is disputed. It also had ebony, ivory, incense, exotic animals, and a route south into the rest of Africa for everything else. So from very early on, Egypt looked south with enormous interest, and the people living there had every reason to organize themselves well enough to be difficult to take. They did. By around 2500 BCE, there was a substantial kingdom centered on a city called Kerma, just south of the Third Cataract. Kerma is not a small site. At its height, it covered a large area with a dense town, workshops, and an enormous mud brick structure called the Western Defufa, which still stands today as a solid mass of brick nearly 20 meters high. There are royal burials there of extraordinary scale, some under mounds tens of meters across, containing hundreds of sacrificed retainers. That last detail is grim, and it is also a signal. You do not bury 400 people with a king unless you have a state powerful enough to make that happen. Kerma also produced pottery that is genuinely beautiful and completely distinct from anything Egyptian. Thin-walled beakers with a polished black rim above a deep red body, the transition between the two shading through a band of blue-grey. It is technically difficult, it is instantly recognizable, and nobody in Egypt was making anything like it. When a civilization develops a signature style that its powerful neighbor does not share and does not copy, that tells you something about how independent it actually was. Kerma traded with Egypt, fought Egypt, and at one point, when Egypt was weak and fragmented, appears to have pushed north and raided deep into Egyptian territory. There is Egyptian material in Kerma graves that most likely arrived as plunder. Then, around 1500 BCE, Egypt got strong again. The new kingdom pharaohs came south with an army that Kerma could not match, destroyed the city, and annexed the whole of Nubia as far as the fourth cataract. For the next 400 years, Nubia was an Egyptian colony. This is the part of the story that usually gets told when any of it gets told at all. Egypt goes south. Egypt wins. Nubia becomes a province. It is true. It is also about 400 years out of a 4,000-year story, and it is the only stretch where Egypt is in charge, and Egypt colonized it thoroughly. Temples to Egyptian gods, Egyptian administration, Egyptian language for official business. The sons of Nubian elites taken north to be educated at the Egyptian court, then sent back to govern on Egypt's behalf, which is a technique empires keep rediscovering. The god Amun in particular took root. A great temple was built at Gebel Barkal, a flat-topped sandstone mountain beside the Nile that the Egyptians identified as a home of Amun himself. That mountain matters later. Then Egypt collapsed. Not dramatically, but definitively. Around the 11th century BCE, the new kingdom fell apart. Egyptian power withdrew from Nubia, and the records go quiet for about 3 centuries. We genuinely do not know what happened during that gap. When Nubia comes back into view, there is a new kingdom in the south, centered first on a place called El Kuru and then on Napata, near that same sacred mountain. Its rulers are buried under pyramids. They worship Amun. They use Egyptian titles and Egyptian religious language, and they are not Egyptian. They are Kushite, and they are about to do something remarkable. By the 8th century BCE, Egypt had been fragmented for generations. Rival dynasties in the delta, competing princes, no central authority worth the name, and the priesthood of Amun at Thebes in the south was watching this with dismay. The Kushite king Piye came north, his own account of it, carved on a granite stela and one of the most detailed military narratives to survive from the ancient world, presents the campaign as a religious duty. Egypt had fallen into disorder. Its rulers had neglected Amun. He was coming to put things right. He besieged and took city after city up the Nile. There is a detail in that account that has kept people fond of him for 2,500 years. When he finally took the city of Hermopolis and its ruler surrendered, Piye went to inspect the stables, found the horses had been starved during the siege, and was reportedly angrier about that than about anything the man had actually done to him. And the stela records something you rarely see in a conquest inscription. When one defeated ruler surrendered, Piye refused to enter his palace because the man had not purified himself and kept uncircumcised men and fish-eaters in his household. Piye is presenting himself as more properly Egyptian, more religiously correct than the Egyptians. That is the whole political argument in one gesture. He is not a foreign conqueror, he is a restorer. Piye took Egypt, accepted the submission of its rulers, and then, having done it, went home to Napata and was buried under a pyramid there. His successors made it permanent. For roughly the next century, Kushite kings ruled an empire stretching from the confluence of the Niles in modern Sudan all the way to the Mediterranean coast. In Egyptian history, they are the 25th dynasty, and they were not treated as an aberration. Later, Egyptian king lists include them. Egyptian priests served under them. They built and restored temples across Egypt on a scale nobody had managed for centuries, deliberately reviving older artistic styles, reaching back past the recent mess to a classical Egyptian past they claimed as their own. The greatest of them was Taharqa, who ruled for over 25 years and built extensively at Karnak, at Gebel Barkal, and across both kingdoms. He is one of the few Kushite rulers whose name most people have technically encountered without knowing it, because he appears in the Hebrew Bible in the account of the Assyrian threat to Jerusalem as Taharqa, king of Kush, marching out to fight. He also made an enemy he could not handle. The Assyrian Empire was expanding, and Assyria and Kush both wanted influence over the small states of the Levant. Taharqa backed resistance to Assyria there, which meant that when the Assyrians decided to settle the matter, they came for Egypt. They had iron weapons in quantity, siege engineering, and a professional army built for exactly this. Taharqa fought them, lost Memphis, retook it, lost it again. His successor Tantamani tried once more, and the Assyrians came back and sacked Thebes itself, which was a shock felt across the whole region. The Kushites withdrew south. They did not collapse. They simply stopped being an Egyptian power and went back to being a Nubian one, and that turned out to be a very long-lived arrangement. Over the following centuries, the center of the kingdom moved further south, from Napata to Meroe, well upriver, in a region with summer rainfall. That move is worth pausing on, because it changes what the kingdom is. Napata sits in the desert and depends on the Nile, absolutely. Meroe sits in a belt where seasonal rains actually fall, which means grazing land, cattle and agriculture that is not purely dependent on the flood. It is further from Egypt, harder for a northern army to reach, and better positioned for the trade routes running east to the Red Sea and south and west into the rest of Africa. Meroe also had iron, substantial ironworking, with slag heaps around the city large enough that early archaeologists, with some exaggeration, called it the Birmingham of Africa. That comparison oversells the industrial scale, but the ironworking was real and significant, and it mattered strategically. The Assyrians had beaten Kush partly with iron. Meroe sat next to both the ore and the fuel to make its own, and at Meroe, the culture starts to shift. The Egyptian veneer thins. Egyptian gods remain, but a distinctly Nubian one becomes prominent. Apedemak, a lion-headed war god with no Egyptian equivalent. At one temple, he is carved with 3 faces and 4 arms, which is not an Egyptian convention at all, and has prompted a long and unresolved argument about whether it reflects contact with India through the Red Sea trade, or is simply a local idea that arrived at a similar solution. Art changes. Royal figures are depicted with fuller bodies and different regalia. Architecture develops its own vocabulary, and crucially, they stop writing in Egyptian. Around the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, the Meroites developed their own writing system for their own language, Meroitic. It has 2 forms, one hieroglyphic and one cursive, and it is alphabetic or near alphabetic, with around 23 signs. Here is where it gets frustrating. We can read Meroitic. An English archaeologist named Francis Llewellyn Griffith worked out the sound values in the early 20th century, largely by using royal names that also appear in Egyptian, so the phonetics were solved over a century ago. You can hand a Meroitic inscription to a specialist today and they will pronounce it for you, sign by sign, with reasonable confidence. They just cannot tell you what most of it means. It is worth sitting with how unusual that is. Normally the 2 problems come together. You crack the signs and the meaning arrives with them because you already knew the language and just could not see it through the script. Here the script gave way immediately and the language did not give way at all. Because the language underneath is not related to Egyptian and not clearly related to anything well documented, it appears to belong to a Nilo-Saharan grouping, and there has been real progress connecting it to modern languages in the region, but the vocabulary is largely unrecovered. We know some words. Funerary formulas which repeat are partly understood. Titles, kinship terms, some numerals. Beyond that, we have thousands of texts that we can sound out and not comprehend, which is a peculiar kind of silence, not a locked door. A door standing open onto a room where everyone is speaking a language you do not know. Now the queens. Kush had ruling women, and not occasionally. The title Kandake, which Greek and Roman writers rendered as Candace and sometimes mistook for a personal name, refers to a royal woman of enormous status, usually the king's mother, and in several cases a ruler in her own right. Meroitic art shows them in a way Egyptian art almost never shows queens. Full-figured, in heavy jewelry, standing over defeated enemies holding weapons. These are not consorts depicted at a husband's knee. They are depicted doing what kings are depicted doing. The descent of the throne appears to have run through the royal women, rather than simply from father to son, which would explain the status. It also means that when Greek and Roman writers kept encountering powerful women in charge in Kush, and kept assuming they had all coincidentally been given the same name, they were misreading a job title. And one of them fought Rome. In the 20s BCE, Egypt had recently become a Roman province. The Roman prefect took troops south into Arabia, and the Kushites, under a Kandake the Romans called Candace, attacked across the frontier. Roman sources describe her as one-eyed. Her name was Amanirenas. Kushite forces struck the southern Egyptian towns, including Aswan, and they took the Roman statues there, including bronze statues of the Emperor Augustus himself. Rome responded, as Rome did, with a punitive campaign that pushed south and sacked Napata. The Roman account of it, which is the only detailed one we have, is written by people with every incentive to present the outcome as a victory. What happened next suggests otherwise, and then something unusual happened. The war ended in a negotiated settlement, and the terms were remarkably favorable to Kush. The frontier was adjusted, and according to the Greek geographer Strabo, the tribute Rome had been demanding was cancelled. Rome did not usually cancel tribute. Kush had fought the greatest military power in the Mediterranean world to a position where Augustus decided the southern frontier was not worth the cost and left it alone for centuries. But my favorite part is what happened to the statue. In 1910, archaeologists excavating at Meroe found a bronze head of Augustus, with the inlaid eyes still in place, buried beneath the threshold of a temple. Not hidden, not stored. Placed under a doorway so that everyone who entered the building would walk over the face of the Roman emperor. That head is in the British Museum today, and it is one of the finest surviving bronze portraits of Augustus anywhere, and the reason it survived in such good condition is that somebody in Meroe wanted the pleasure of stepping on it every single day. It is a 2,000-year-old insult that worked so well it preserved the evidence. Meroe continued for another 3 centuries after that. It traded with Rome, with the Red Sea world, with India indirectly. It declined gradually from around the 3rd century CE. The reasons are not settled. Trade routes shifted east toward the Red Sea and away from the Nile corridor. There is evidence of environmental stress, including erosion and overgrazing, possibly worsened by the demands of iron working on local timber. Rome's own economic troubles reduced a major market. And in the 4th century, the Kingdom of Aksum, in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, was rising. An Aksumite inscription describes a campaign against Meroe. Whether that was a killing blow or an opportunistic strike against a kingdom already failing is unclear, and the honest answer is that Meroe probably came apart from several directions at once. What followed was not emptiness. 3 Christian Nubian kingdoms emerged in the same territory, and they were substantial states. When Muslim armies swept across Egypt and North Africa in the 7th century, they moved south into Nubia and were fought to a standstill. The result was a treaty called the Baqt, an arrangement of exchange and non-aggression that lasted, in some form, for 600 years. Christian Nubia remained independent long after almost everywhere else in the region had been incorporated. So, why has almost nobody heard of any of this? Part of it is straightforward. Sudan has been difficult to work in for long stretches of the last century. Excavation is harder, funding is thinner, and a lot of Nubian archaeology has been rescue work, racing rising water behind the Aswan dams. Whole sites are now under a reservoir, and in the 1960s, an international rescue effort moved what it could ahead of the water, which is how a handful of Nubian temples ended up relocated stone by stone, and a great deal else ended up drowned. But part of it is not straightforward at all, and it is worth saying plainly. When European scholarship encountered Nubian civilization in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it very often refused to credit it. The pyramids at Meroe, the temples, the ironworking, the writing system were repeatedly explained as things that must have come from Egypt, or from some hypothetical lighter-skinned migrant population, rather than being developed by the Nubians themselves. One prominent early excavator of Kerma concluded that the site was an Egyptian outpost governed by an Egyptian, because he could not accept that Africans had built it. Later work overturned that comprehensively. Kerma was an indigenous African kingdom, and a wealthy one, and it was doing very well before Egypt ever controlled it. That was not an isolated error. It was a pattern, and it shaped which sites got funded, which got published, and which got into the textbooks that shaped the popular picture. The correction has not been a matter of finding new sympathies. It has been a matter of digging. Kerma turned out to have deep local roots predating any Egyptian presence. Meroitic turned out to be an entirely separate language written in an entirely separate script. The pyramid fields turned out to run for centuries after Egypt had stopped building anything of the kind. Modern Nubian archaeology has been steadily dismantling all of that for decades. The picture now is of a civilization with continuous roots going back over 4,000 years, in constant exchange with Egypt, but never simply derivative of it, which conquered its more famous neighbour, outlasted it as an independent state by centuries, developed its own script and its own gods, and stopped a Roman emperor at its border. And there is something almost fitting about how it ends up as a story about writing. Egypt is famous partly because its script was cracked, and so Egypt got to speak at enormous length, and everything it said went into our books. Kush wrote too. Thousands of inscriptions in an alphabet of their own devising, and we can pronounce every one of them. We simply do not know what they say yet. Egyptian had the Rosetta Stone, a single object, carrying the same message in a script people could read alongside one they could not. Meroitic has no equivalent. There is no bilingual long enough to break it open, and unless one comes out of the ground, progress has to come the slow way, by comparison with living languages and by grinding through the texts we have. There are perhaps 2,000 Meroitic texts known. The work on the language is ongoing, and it is genuinely progressing, with more comparative material from living Nilo-Saharan languages than Griffith ever had, which means the pyramids in the desert are not the last word on these people. Somewhere in those 2,000 inscriptions is a description of Amanirenas, in her own language, written by people who knew her. We can already say the sounds of it out loud. We are just waiting to understand what we are saying.